And we are live. So, welcome to the final conference of this second edition of the Colloquium on Metaphysics and Semantics of Fiction. I have the pleasure to be here with Eleonora Orlando from Universidad de Buenos Aires. She's a professor there, and she specializes in the philosophy of language, having worked on the theory of reference, general terms and rigidity, the contextualist debate, and the semantics and ontology of fictional names. Currently, she's working on the synthetic, semantic, and pragmatic analysis of slurs and thick aesthetic predicates and judgments. She's also interested in some problems in the philosophy of literature, such as the ontology and interpretation of literary works. She has been the president of ALFAN, the Latin American Association of Analytic Philosophy, and of SADAF, Sociedad Argentina de Análisis Filosófico. She's the co-editor with Selene Rodriguez and Andrés Saab of the book Formal Approaches to the Languages of South America, forthcoming at Springer. And today she will present to us the talk Fiction as Declaration. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Eleonora. It's great to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Italo and Jersey, for the invitation. I want to apologize because I couldn't be present as much as I would have wanted to, because I'm giving exams and I am in the middle of a financial operation that is driving me crazy. So I think I missed a lot of talks that I could have liked to be able to attend. But thank you really for the invitation. I'm very happy to take part in this colloquium. So I'll start with this talk, which is about the nature of the illocutionary force of fiction. Well, now I have a problem with this. I'm sorry. It's stuck again. Wait a minute. Well, okay. So what I'm going to defend is the thesis that the acts of creating and consuming narrative fiction are declarative speech acts or speech acts with a declarative illocutionary force. So they comprise the so-called fictive or fictional, as Italo was saying, uses of language. Fictive, fictional, textual, yeah, they are synonyms. I will focus on literary fictive uses, which I take to be the paradigmatic ones, but the thesis also covers non-literary ones, and I will say something about this distinction. So the kind of text of use that I am interested is exemplified by this sentence, which is part of Borges' short story, Funes de Memorius. No? We at a stroke perceive 3 cups lying on a table. Funes could see all the shoots and clusters and fruit comprised by a vine. So as an initial point of clarification, I could say that I won't be concerned with discourse used to talk about fiction. Like, for instance, parafictive of parafictional uses, as according to Funes de Memorius, Funes recovers consciousness with the skill of remembering everything, or metafictive or metafictional uses, such as Funes de Memorius manifests Borges' obsession with the infinite. So as know, this declarative view is not the most common explanation of fictive uses. The 2 most extended ones are the pretense view, according to which fiction involves pure pretense, and the make-believe view, according to which fiction has a directive or prescriptive illocutionary force. Different versions of the declarative view have been defended by Abel, Lemos, Linz, Bergman, and Franzen, and by myself in a previous article. But I like to mention that French literary critic Gérard Genet is a good antecedent of this view. So the plan is, first, to offer some grounds for the ascription of a declarative character to fictive uses. Second, to consider some objections. Then I will go on with a brief comparison with alternative views, with those alternative views I have just mentioned. And finally, I will modify, I will make an addition to the thesis in the light of a criticism coming from one of those alternative views. So, according to classic speech act theory, exercitives or declaratives are speech acts whose illocutionary point is to produce or create a new entity or state of affairs, something that did not exist before the utterance, by virtue of exploiting certain norms whose existence is part of their success, or in Austin's words, felicity conditions, which determines a change of status, of normative status for the person or the thing involved. So this is a quote from Searle. Declarative speech acts are cases where one brings a state of affairs into existence by declaring it to exist. So what are the typical examples? For instance, so-called supernatural acts, that is, acts of creating something by means of language. For instance, when God said, let there be light. Then we have purely linguistic declarations, which involve the invention of a word, as in naming something or someone, abbreviating an idea, defining an expression. Then we have institutional acts, the very famous one, very famous examples like baptizing someone, declaring someone guilty, giving someone a fine, marrying two people, promulgating a law, etc. So for some people, the fictive act is basically of the first kind, no? That is comparable to the act of a demiurge, of someone who creates something from scratch, except for the fact that what is created in the fictional case is something purely imaginary or fictional. For other philosophers, the fictive act is purely a linguistic, it's a purely linguistic declaration, not as abbreviating or defining a term. But for instance, this is a quotation by Genet, who says exactly that. No? The fiat of the author of fiction lies somewhere between those of the demiurge and the onomaturge. His power presupposes, as that of the latter, the more or less tacit agreement of an audience who, according to Coleridge's durable phrase, willfully suspend their disbelief. In my view, the fictive act, though having features characteristics of this of the three kinds of declarations, is basically an act of the third kind, namely an institutional act. Let's consider an analogy. In baptizing a baby, the priest creates a new state of affairs, that is the baby's baptism. In so doing, he exploits the religious norms, establishing a conventional procedure constitutive of a sacrament called baptism. The output involves a change in the baby's normative status. She becomes a member of the Catholic Church, and as such, she starts being subject to some expectations and commandments. For example, she's expected to get married, to have children, and she's not allowed to get a divorce, for instance, an abortion, or to change gender, etc. So the normative status of the baby changes. So So we can ask a similar question concerning what happens when the fictive act takes place. What is created or produced by means of a fictive speech act? And what are the norms exploited? And what kind of normative changes are determined? So, in my opinion, what is created or produced is a component of a fictional narrative or of the fictive word or set of words determined by the narrative. So the fictive act is part of, of the process of creating something bigger or broader, which is a fictional narrative. So as a first attempt, I would say that in terms of our initial example, when Borges utters the sentence, "we at a stroke perceive 3 cups lying on a table," blah, 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 he creates a fragment of a fictional narrative, Funes de Memorias, including that sentence and the fictive fact correlated with it that makes it fictionally true. He creates the fact that the sentence is true within, of course, not strictly true, but true within the framework of Funes de Memorias. So, with regard to that creative process, it is possible to distinguish at least 2 aspects: what might be called the articulatory aspect, which is the sentence itself, and the propositional aspect, which is the fictive fact. No, as suggested by Searle, the direction of fit is double. No, the sentence fits the fact, and vice versa, since both are established as fictive by means of the same speech act. An important clarification, though a bit lateral, is that not everything that is fictive is fictional. No? The facts and characters featured in the story may well be real facts and people that are integrated or incorporated into the fictional narrative. So that's why I prefer to use the word fictive instead of fictional, because fictive is related to the fiction, and it doesn't necessarily imply that the fact or the event or the character is purely fictional. It's not real. But I'm not going to be concerned with that aspect. So which norms are being exploited? That's a question we may ask. And I think that they are linguistic norms, of course, but also a kind of social norms. A bit in the line of what Elisa was saying before. There is a bunch of social conventions that are being exploited in the creation of a fictional narrative. And I would say that those norms are the norms governing artistic practices. So artistic practices, as is well known, constitute a very heterogeneous group. They involve production, editing, publication, marketing, distribution, press, exhibition, consumption, aesthetic evaluation, literary criticism, cultural recognition, quotation, plagiarism, etc. So these practices are governed by regulative and constitutive norms, depending on the case, not what particular practice we're talking about. And also the norms at stake can be explicit in certain modes, like, I don't know, the norms regulate the distribution of books, for instance. But sometimes they are implicit in the very practices. So the practices, those social practices that are not explicitly codified in a legislation, determine what Dickey called the art world, which can be considered to define the institution of art. That's why those practices are institutional practices. So we might say that among the norms involved governing those practices, some are constitutive and some are specifically constitutive of the fictive speech act, with what I've been calling the fictive speech act. And I would say that the speech act belonging in the framework of artistic practices is fictive if and only if it takes part in the process of creating a fictional narrative. And so the idea is that a fictive speech act takes part in the process of creating a linguistic object with a special normative status, which is an artistic object. So the idea is that the fictive act takes part in the process of creating this very peculiar object. And what is the normative change that takes place? Well, the sentence used in the fictive act turns out to be true in the fiction, of course, not strictly true, but true in the fiction, or temporarily accepted in the fiction if we take into account unreliable narrators, by virtue of its correlation with a fictive fact, which again could be either fictional or real incorporated into the fictional world. Another change is that this sentence start contributing to play an aesthetic, cultural, or entertaining function, precisely in as far as it takes part of this peculiar object, the artistic object with a very specific normative status. It also belongs in a broader text or piece of discourse that can be evaluated or assessed as good or bad from an aesthetic point of view, and it acquires some dispositional properties, like being replicated or retold, interpreted, translated, edited, published, criticized by literary critics, plagiarized, banned, etc. Lots of dispositional properties that the object, the sentence as part of this narrative acquires, in the act of being fictively used. So we have a new normative space for the author and the reader too, not just for the text. In terms of Brandom, the Brandom of making it explicit, we could say that the author acquires new commitments and entitlements with regard to the sentence. She commits herself to its truth in the fiction or its temporary acceptability. She commits herself to the truth or temporary acceptability of other sentences inferentially related to the sentence at stake, inferentially related either by logical implication or by conversational implicature. She entitles the reader to import other sentences by means of applying principles such as the reality principle or the common belief principle. Now, if we follow Lewis, or we could consider other kind of importation principles. She entitles the reader also to replicate it, not to retell the whole story in which this sentence takes part. So these are what I think might be called the replicative fictive uses, the fictive uses made not by the author, but by the readers. She also entitles the reader to interpret it, reformulate it. For instance, a form of reformulation is translation, and to utter other sentences that are also true in the fiction. Those would be what I think might be called not replicative, but interpretive fictive uses, not by the reader. And the author also entitles the reader to inform about its content. For instance, in the context of a literature lesson or whatever. No, she entitles the reader to talk about its content. Those are the parafictive uses. No, when the reader talks about the content of a fictional narrative, but from an external point of view, with this idea of trying to remain loyal to what the author says, no, in the fiction. And finally, also, she entitles the reader to critically assess its content in relation to its participation in the broader text constitutive of the literary work. Those would be the so-called metafictive uses. So all these things are new entitlements, no? And to be committed and to be entitled are clearly normative attitudes. And those are motivated, determined by the acquisition of this new status by the text or the sentence, if we are talking about a particular individual sentence. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm doing something wrong with this. Okay. Yeah. So I will say something about replicative acts and about interpretive acts, which are, to me, the two fictive acts that may be performed by the reader. So the fictive acts performed by the author, the original, let's say, fictive acts, the acts of creating the fictional narrative, can be compared to the promulgation of a law by a legislator, no? Whereas the replicative acts performed by a reader can be compared to the application of a law by a judge, in the sense that the replicator enforces a pre-existent narrative as much as a judge enforces a pre-existent law, no? To which they must be loyal. And the interpretive acts, no, the ones, the acts of recreating the fiction performed by the reader, but on the basis of a process of interpretation, can also be construed as declarative speech acts. In this time, analogous to the application of a pre-existent law by a judge, by taking into account the interpretive task that many judges usually perform. So I think that we can make an analogy between how the promulgation and the application of a law changes the status, the normative status of the text involved, and the creation and recreation, be it purely replicative or interpretive, performed by the reader, no, of a fictional narrative. So both replicative and interpretive acts have declarative force as far as they involve the recreation, no, in the case of the replicative, and the creation in the case of the interpretive acts of sentences that are constitutive of the fictional narrative, because the idea is that the reader who interprets the text also provides new sentences, no? New sentences with their corresponding fictive facts. So I could say that there is something that could be called the meta-narrative of fictional narrative, which is the idea that a schematic and simplified version of these norms, both constitutive and regulative, depending on the case, all these norms that govern artistic practices, is part of the speaker's social knowledge. So there is a schematic idea of how those artistic practices are regulated. No, not a very precise idea, but I would think that it's part of our social knowledge, what kind of practices are involved are involved in the creation and consumption of literary works. So this meta-narrative, which would be this narrative which contains this simplified version of the norms, might be said to be part of the common ground of a conversation, if we can talk of a conversation between the producer, the author, and the consumer, the reader of fictional narratives. So it could be like one of you were saying some minutes ago, a kind of conversation with a delay, a typical example of not a face-to-face conversation. So what are for me the theoretical advantages of the declarative view? So I think I agree with Bergman and Franzen, for instance, that the view accounts for the creative aspect of the speech act performed by the author, the literary author. But I think that basically it places that creative act in the social and institutional framework constitutive of artistic practices, and it explains the peculiar normative status of fictional narratives and the people participating in those practices, both as authors and readers. So now I would like to address two concerns. One is related to the fact that some fictive acts may not seem to involve the social practices characteristic of the art world. For instance, the short story, I used to tell to my son before going to sleep. And the second concern is related to the so-called authority issue, the fact that declarative speech acts are supposed to involve a speaker endowed with some institutional authority, formal authority, someone like a priest or a judge. So as far as the first concern is concerned, there are different levels of participation in the art world, I would say. The non-literary forms of fiction, to me, are the same kind of entities than literary ones, because they are characterized by the same meta-narrative. In both cases, the facts narrated are fictive facts, that is, they could be real but integrated in a fictional story. They have an entertainment, aesthetic, educational, or cultural value. They are accessible as good or bad, as aesthetically good or bad. They possess the same dispositional properties, like being subject to the practices of retelling or replication, interpretation, translation, editing, publishing, plagiarism, etc. So they may acquire, as a matter of fact, any of these properties, but they have all those properties in a dispositional form. So the main difference I can see is the one related to the fact that literary works are open to a more complex and canonical, let's say, aesthetic evaluation. So the aesthetic evaluation is in terms of artistic canons, let's say. Following Walton, we might even say that even children's games may be included among those proto-forms of fiction. And as for the second concern, which is reproduced there, the creation of fictional narrative as opposed to presiding over a religious ceremony or dispensing justice, does not seem to require that the person has a position of authority. But I would say that there are other ways in which someone may be considered to have the authority to do something. For instance, authority is informally endowed in those cases in which someone is spontaneously recognized as the leader of a group, as you may recall that happens in the novel The Lord of the Flies, or more recently in the series Lost. And likewise, I think that someone can be spontaneously recognized as an author if her performance is considered to adjust to the meta-narrative of fiction, which implies endowing the person with a certain kind of epistemic authority. Epistemic authority in the sense of having a certain knowledge how. So this is how I would reply, or how I would address these two concerns. But now let me move on to some comments regarding the possible alternative views. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, the alternative views are two. The first one, and the most well-known, I think, is the pretense view, no? Introduced by Searle in his famous article from 1975, and then endorsed by many other philosophers, no? Kripke, Lewis, Recanati, Predeli, etc. A clear antecedent is, of course, Frege, no? We will see why. And then there is the make-believe view, defended by Carey, Garcia Carpintero, and many other authors. So let's say something about the pretense view. According to Searle's famous article, in fiction, what he calls vertical rules are suspended. So those are the rules relating the linguistic realm with the facts. And what he wants to say is that in particular, there are no genuine assertions, but only pretended ones. So there is no direction of fit between language and reality. It's not that what we say, our utterances adjust to the facts or anything like that. So his conclusion is that fictive utterances lack illocutionary force. And Frege is an antecedent because Frege also said that in fiction, the force is suspended. We propose a thought, but we don't propose it as true. We don't present it. We don't present the thought as true. So, which is what happens when we judge, and then when we assert, no, which would be the verbal articulation of the mental act of judging. But then I would like to consider this reply by Jeanette, no, which is, according to him, no, to produce pretended assertions or to pretend to produce assertions cannot exclude a priori that by producing this, no, the pretended assertion, or by pretending to produce them, we actually perform another act, which is to produce a fiction. So Jeanette's idea is that fictive uses can be understood as a kind of indirect speech act. No, he interprets fictive acts as indirect speech acts. In pretending to assert, the author is indirectly doing something else, namely creating a fictional narrative. The problem with this reply, from my point of view, is that pretending to assert is not performing a speech act. That's exactly Sir's point, no? Pretending to assert is not doing anything with language. So the only speech act involved would be the declarative one for Jeanette. There wouldn't be two speech acts, as it is the case with any indirect speech act. But I still think that Jeanette is in the right direction, exactly because he kind of foresaw this declarative view. So now I'm going to consider Searle's determination argument, no? The so-called determination argument against the idea that in fiction, sentences have a certain, cannot have a certain specific illocutionary act, force. So the idea of the determination argument is that the meaning of a sentence determines the kind of illocutionary act that is performed by means of that sentence, by means of using that sentence. This is the determination principle according to Carey. And then the other point that Searle emphasizes is that the meaning of fictive discourse is similar to the meaning of non-fictive one. In both cases, we find declarative sentences such as, there was a cat waiting at the door, which are interpreted in exactly the same way. So if the meaning of fictive discourse is similar to the meaning of non-fictive one, and the meaning determines the kind of illocutionary force, so there couldn't be any difference, no, between fictive and non-fictive discourse, no. Fictive discourse cannot have a specific illocutionary force across the board, no, different from the usual ones we find in non-fictive discourse. Otherwise, its global meaning would be different, and we wouldn't be able to understand it as it is the case, no. So the usual common reply, which is can be traced back to Carey in 1985, is that this determination principle is false, because a sentence with a certain propositional content can be used to perform more than one illocutionary act. No? There are multiple examples of that. If I say I'm cold, this sentence can be used to inform that I'm cold, or can be used to ask someone to close the window, for instance. I think what lies behind this idea is that it's necessary to take into account that propositional content is different and independent from illocutionary force. Even when fictive utterances had an illocutionary force that is different from the one generally ascribed to non-fictive one, they would only differ from the latter in their pragmatic component, no? In their illocutionary force, but not in their propositional one, because those two components are completely independent of each other. They are conceptually different and independent of each other. And that what explains the fact that we are perfectly able to understand those sentences, because we can grasp the propositional content, even if, for instance, we couldn't grasp the illocutionary force. But I think that the determination argument is based on the fact that for Searle, deep down, propositional content and illocutionary force are not completely independent. The illocutionary force is reduced, can be expressed by means of propositional content. Okay, doesn't matter. What I would like to consider is a more sophisticated version, no, the uniformity argument presented by Predelli in an article from 2019. According to this uniformity argument, the idea is that relations among the different forces are uniform in both fictive and non-fictive discourse. For instance, an assertion of "it is cold" cannot be followed by a question, "is it cold?" either in a fictional or a non-fictional narrative. So the idea that those relations among the different forces are the same, are uniform, and they have to be preserved. So fictive utterances cannot have a dedicated or a specific illocutionary force because they must exhibit the same illocutionary variety, so to say, that we find in non-fictive utterances. So what I could say from the perspective that I proposed at the beginning is that a fictive utterance involves or can be thought to involve two speech acts in a peculiar way. On the one hand, a declarative speech act performed by the author or the reader in recreational fictive speech acts. And on the other hand, an assertive or directive or whatever force might be at stake, ascribed by the author or the reader to a narrator. So this complicates a bit the initial landscape because I would like to introduce this idea of a narrator who performs this second act. So in performing his declarative speech act, Borges ascribes an assertive speech act to a narrator. Therefore, the state of affairs that is declared to exist include, on top of an articulation and the fictive fact correlated with it, a fictive narrator to whom an assertion is ascribed which have the same content of Borges' declarative act. So my second attempt would be to say something along the following lines. When Borges utters our initial fictive sentence, "we at a stroke perceive 3 cups on a table," blah, 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 he creates a fictional narrative, including a narrator performing in turn a speech act with the very content, with the same content, but assertive illocutionary force. More specifically, Borges creates the fictive act correlated with her declarative utterance by means of ascribing an assertive act with that very same content to a fictive narrator. Okay, this could be a consequence that I'm not going to explore. I'm just proposing it as a possible development. That is, if fictive acts involve the ascription of a speech act to a narrator, then it seems that fictive utterances might be analyzed as similar in structure and content to a propositional attitude ascription, in which the subject of the main sentence refers to the narrator. No? Our fictive utterance would have this content, let's say. The narrator asserts that "we at a stroke," blah, 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 blah. But I'm not going to expand on this suggestion. Yeah, okay. So instead, I would like to move on to the make-believe view and say something about it, as the other alternative I'm opposing. According to many authors, the speech characteristic of fictive utterances is directive or prescriptive, as I said at the beginning. So the idea is what the author does is inviting the reader to imagine a situation by means of the recognition of her intention. That is, by means of a gradation procedure. This is the intentionalist version due to Curry, or by means of exploiting a social norm constitutive of fictional discourse, which prescribes the readers to imagine on account of the aesthetic rewarding value of such imaginings. So it's a kind of a social norms that regulate the use of fictional discourse based on the aesthetic value of such discourse. And this is the conventionalist version due to Garcia Carpintero. Okay, so I would like to take into account this quotation by Genet, in which he compares the directive view with the declarative view, because I would like to take what he says here to as an element to criticize the directive view. So Genet says that the difference between the directive formulation, because he considers both formulations and he says that both are equally good, but he could go for the declaration view. He had a certain preference for that view, but it's not that he argues clearly in favor of that book. But what I'm interested in is something he says concerning the directive view, which is this. The difference between the directive formulation and the declaration one is that the declaration one consists in presuming its perlocutionary effect. Now, if I say, hereby I bring you to imagine, this is what is supposed to do the author, Yet, he says, this effect is always guaranteed, since the simple fact of hearing or reading that the little girl used to live near a forest inevitably provokes in my mind, if only for just enough time to reject it as fictional or pointless, the thought of a girl near a forest. So I would like to analyze this idea that the imaginative effect is always guaranteed, because I think that's not the case, and that's one of my points against the directive view. On the one hand, if imagining that P is thinking that P, it seems that yes, the effect is guaranteed, right? But then it's not an effect that serves to identify fiction, since it is present in relation to many non-fictive uses with assertive force, such as conjecturing, proposing, supposing, telling, and many others. They all produce in the audience a mental state that doesn't amount to the belief that something is the case. So if imagining is propositional imagining, or something like thinking that P, it's not enough to identify the illocutionary effect of fiction and to discriminate it from the illocutionary effect of other kinds of fictional or non-fictive discourse. On the other hand, if imagining that P involves a sensitive capacity, which is the traditional conception of imagination, not as a partly, at least, sensitive capacity, so the capacity not to produce visual, auditive, tactile images, the effect does not seem to be warranted. Why? Because I think that reading fiction does not require an exercise of sensitive imagination in relation to every single fictive use. So the claim must be that it is the global aesthetic appreciation of the artwork that requires an exercise of imagination. But again, if that were the case, the imaginative effect wouldn't serve to distinguish fictive from non-fictive discourse, because understanding and appreciating a history book, a scientific treatise, or a journalist article also may be conceived as requiring an exercise of imagination of a similar kind. This is something that has been argued by Stacy Friend, for instance. So the idea is that it doesn't seem sufficient to discriminate fiction from nonfiction. Another reason for the insufficiency of the imaginative effect, and to me maybe the most important one, is that even granting that a global imaginative effect were necessary for the aesthetic appreciation of a fictional narrative in total, let's say, no, the reader is not mainly somebody who is invited to imagine a fictive world, but I think she's mainly somebody who enters into the art world, namely somebody who takes part in certain practices concerned with the production and consumption of art, and somebody who agrees to conform to certain norms. And those norms, no, are very complex. Now, the practices are much more varied than the coordination of images between authors and readers, and they involve many more norms than the ones oriented to solving coordination problems between the respective images of authors and readers. So it seems to me that the main point of producing and consuming fiction is not to coordinate the imaginative lives of people. It's something else. It's like taking part in some kind of social practices, the artistic practices that are an institutional, play a very important institutional role in society. So to summarize, fictive acts, both in creating and in recreating fictional narratives, that is, the fictive acts performed both by the authors and the readers, can be conceived as declarative speech acts, exploiting the existence of constitutive and regulative rules, norms that are characteristic of a certain kind of artistic practice, and determining a specific normative space, including fictional narratives and their respective authors and readers. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Orlando, for this excellent conference. Very rich, very insightful. So we have time for questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Italo.
Well, thank you very much, Eleonora, for your great conference. It was really interesting and really enriching for the discussion. I am really sympathetic to the view you are endorsing here, that fictive or fictional utterances are declarations. I think this is a position that takes into account the fact that authors are creative individuals. And in order to make my question, I would like to raise a previous question that is regarding a clarification. Are you endorsing the position that effective utterance involves two speech acts in this case, a declaration on the one side and on the other side, the narrator that is, performing any kind of elocutionary force? But are there two different speech acts involved?
No.
Or just one, the declaration?
Yeah, that's a very good question because I wasn't very clear about that aspect. The idea is that there are two speech acts involved, but they are not two speech acts performed by the same subject. So the author performs a declarative act, but this declarative act involves the creation of another act, let's say, with a certain articulatory aspect, which is the sentence used, but also a propositional aspect, which is the let's say, the fact correlated with that sentence, and also a narrator who would be the subject of the act. So the idea is that narrator, act, or sentence, let's say, narrator, sentence, and fact are part of this fictional world, are part of what is created by the author in performing a declarative act. So there are two acts, but they are not two acts with the same subject. The author performs just one act, the other act is ascribed to the narrator. So you might say, well, this is an independent debate, but I tend to think that there is always a narrator. Sometimes the narrator is an explicit character, not as in homodiegetic narratives. But in other cases, well, I tend to think that there is a narrator who is not explicit, no, an implicit, omniscient narrator. But I know that there is something going on there. But I could say that if you create a sentence with a content, there is no problem in thinking that this sentence is ascribed to a fictive subject, which is the narrator.
Yeah, that's perfect. You have anticipated the second question, actually, because I would ask if there is a narrator that performs the second speech act, and if in some cases the narrator is a fictional character, how can, I don't know, an abstract artifact or a concept perform a speech act in this case? Because I totally agree with you that the author is performing a declaration. That's I wouldn't change a thing in this reply. But when it comes to the second speech act that narrator is performing, if the narrator is not the author, my only issue is how can something abstract perform a speech act in this case? But I understood what you just said. That's very
No,
interesting.
yeah, you're right. But maybe it's a way of putting it. It's just the idea that you represent that a person says something, uses a sentence, an articulation with a certain content, with a certain to describe a certain fact. But that's the only thing. Maybe it was put in a too, I don't know, robust way. It's a representation. It's a representation of someone saying something. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's complicated.
Perfect. And one final remark. Would it be fair to your account to say that the author performs a declaration and the author makes it fictional with the case that the narrator asserts? Would it be fair to your perspective,
Yeah.
or this phrasing is not
No, yeah.
in
Yeah,
accordance?
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Mhm.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up. Can you also say that the narrator performs other speech acts as well? For example, I was thinking about the opening lines to Moby Dick, "Call me Ishmael." The narrator is performing a directive there, right?
Yeah, of course. That's right. Yeah, all the variety. You can ascribe, yeah, paradigmatically. And in this example I chose from Borges, it was an assertive act. But yeah, you can ascribe all the variety of forces to narrators. Yeah.
Okay, Enrique?
Yes, thank you, Eleonora. This is just a little follow-up. Maybe it's too complicated more than what we should do the things. But in cases like I'm thinking on a story by Ursula K. Le Guin, those who will walk away from Omelas, it started to say something like, imagine a city which is like an utopia, and imagine it in the way you rather. In this case, you would consider that the author itself, like the wing, is performing a directive, or the wing is creative, it's declaring a narrator who is performing a directive speech act. In this case, in which the directive is addressed to the reader, not to another character.
Yeah. I have to think more about it, but I would say initially I would say that it is the narrator who performs the directive speech act. Yeah, it's always the narrator. Yeah, yeah. I think it's the author creates this fictional world by ascribing all kinds of speech acts to the narrator. This is what he does. And that's why the author's acts are all declarative. But being declarative doesn't prevent him from ascribing all the variety of illocutionary forces to the people that are the characters of the story, including the narrator, which is not might not be in the story, but it is someone, no, that somewhere next to the story, at least in the fictional world, no. So yeah, but I think more about it, yeah. But I tend to think that yeah, it could be a representation of a speech act ascribed to the narrator too. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. May I ask a question? I will. I love the way you make this metaphor with a juridical system, with a legal system, right? With laws and so on, and this normative aspect. And I like Brandon, your references to Brandon, and I think the way that if we put this in a normative key. I agree with you that the directive view is sort of incompatible with this public view. Wouldn't you say that it's enough for the directive view to say that, well, fiction is about language, fiction is about public things, laws, norms, rules are public, and we can never enforce that people imagine something or don't imagine something, so that from the outset, a normative view about fiction would be incompatible with imagining and with sort of trying to make enforcements and to try to go into other people's heads and check whether they are imagining the right things or not, and so on. So I think if we embrace this sort of normative view of fiction, we have to reject everything about imagination and private life, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, I think that's why, for instance, some people like Catherine Abel thinks that the norms governing fiction are not constitutive norms, but regulative norms, because she tend to think that the function of those norms is coordinating, no, the imaginary activity of different people. Maybe that's why it sounds a little bit less normative, as you could put it. It's just a problem of coordination, no? It's not a problem of what you are supposed to imagine, but as you said, it might still be a problem of what you're supposed to imagine, because you're supposed to coordinate your imagination capacities with the authors or whoever. And I think that it might happen that you like to coordinate, or that it's a good thing to reach a good coordination of images. But to me, it's not essential. That's my problem with that view. It's not essentially, it might be an interesting aspect, even a positive, but it's not what defines the production and consumption of art.
Exactly. I agree. I agree
And
completely.
and thank you for the comment, because I think it might be related to this idea of that is difficult imposing norms of how your imagination is supposed to develop. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. Just a quick follow-up, Italo, if you allow. You exactly coordination can happen at what we speak about fiction, or interpretive practices, or parafictional utterances and so on, but not at the level of imagining, I don't think. Yeah. So
Yeah. But it's very interesting. Yeah, what you pointed to. Yeah.
okay, Italo.
Awesome. I also really enjoy the perspective that fiction is an institution. And I think that you have avoided a lot of problems that Katharina Bell, for example, encounters when she develops her theory, because it looks like you are relying on Dickey's notion of the art world. And I think it's really clever, actually, really nice. But I would like to hear more from you when it comes to rely on the notion that, for example, Walto's examples that children play games of make-believe and those games are fictional. How does that enter into the picture of the art world in this sense?
Yeah.
Because I know that you have suggested that you're trying to accommodate these two notions, but could you give us more details about that? Because I think that's actually the blind spot of the institutional theory, because on the one hand, fiction is not like the state or the church, these big institutions. And the other hand, fiction is not also what Searle, for example, calls the institution of promising. So where can we balance this notion of institution when it comes to fiction?
Yeah.
And thanks again.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think that even if, of course, they are different, no? The short story that you tell a child before going to bed and the literary artwork have in common the fact that they belong to me, to the same ontological category, to put it somehow. And the idea is that this object, which is the artistic object, an object that is produced in this context of artistic practices, is defined by this normative status, which is it's an object playing a certain entertainment or aesthetic cultural function that should be defined more precisely, right? But mostly that acquires a bunch of dispositional properties, like it can be retold, like, I know, no, my grandmother was telling me some stories that then I told my son, or it can be replicated orally, for instance. It could be, I don't know, published eventually. It can be plagiarized. It can be, I don't know, banned for some reason. So the idea is that, and also the idea of the story determining a set of fictional or temporarily accepted propositions that themselves can be retold and replicated. So the idea is that it's an object with, in a sense, defined by the same normative status, unless you think that there is a big difference between excellent art and childish artistic practices. But I tend to think that they are all artistic practices. And then that you can have, of course, an excellent product that you evaluate as perfect and a poor product that you evaluate as bad. But also these short stories that are transmitted from generation to generation are also evaluated. No, a child can tell you, oh no, this is boring. You cannot intend to tell him a story and start telling him about you going to the dentist in the morning, because we'll say, no, stop it. This is boring. Boring is an aesthetic assessment. So in that sense, I think there is a continuity. They are forms belonging in the same group, which is the fact that they are the product of the same kind of practices. How do you identify the practices? Well, it's intuitively, no? They are artistic practices, as they are juridical practices or whatever. But yeah, it's a difficult problem to put everything in the same bag, especially because I have this intuition that I would like to talk about art, but about artistic practices. So that allows me to put together a lot of different things, like children's paintings in kindergarten together with, but I don't have a problem with that. Then that doesn't prevent you from assessing them in different ways, no? But yeah, it's a very interesting point, and yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Italo. I would say that in a similar vein, we can sort of perform music privately and perform other forms of art, painting, and never expose the art in a museum and so on, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm. And then you have famous art that is bad, but it's still art.
Yes. Yeah, that's perfect.
So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Enrique.
I would like to add something that have come up a couple of times before in this colloquium. It's related to truth in fictions and the incapacity to decide the whole set of things that are true in a fiction. We discussed it in Felipe's talk about changes in a canon, for example, in comics, and in the talk of Italo, we discussed about things like unreliable narrators. When you put the capacity to make things truth in fiction in the declaration, but you have also fictive utterances that are not.
Can you repeat it? Because I got a bad connection. I think I couldn't hear you very well.
Yeah, sorry, probably it's my connection.
The last part, just the last part. The beginning.
Okay. Okay. If you put the ability to make something true in fiction in the declaration act, but there are some fictive utterances that are not true in the fictional story. The idea is that the declaration is dispositional. It's something like I declare this true in fiction unless I said the opposite later, or something like that, or how we can understand the change in the declaration of something being true in the fiction.
I see. If I understood the question correctly, the problem would be that you are declaring something to exist, and then you might regret it. You might withdraw that. But this is, I think, connected with the role of the narrator. What you are declaring is that there is a guy who asserts so and so. And then, you declare that the guy is a liar, or for instance, or you direct the readers, to realize that what you declared that he asserted was a lie. So I think that's the exactly the role played by the narrator, who is the person who asserts and performs all the different illocutionary acts. And the idea is that you are always, what you declare is that a person ordered so-and-so or asserted the so-and-so, and then the reader is free to think that the so-and-so was something, not a fictional truth, but a temporary accepted proposition, temporarily acceptable proposition, but not a true proposition. Yeah, I think that that's the utility or the useful point of distinguishing the author from the narrator. The author is the one who makes the declarations, but not the narrator. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's super interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I have to think about it more, but this is what I could say initially. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Thank you. Do we have more questions? No? Okay, so let us once again thank Professor Eleonora for her great talk, for her responses to the questions.
And thanks a lot for the invitation.
Thank you for accepting our invitation.
And well, let's keep in touch.
Sure, yes. That's I'm going to say a few words for wrapping up the colloquium.
Mm-hmm.
And first, an announcement. This edition, we will have a special issue of a journal here in Brazil. It's a journal called Intuicio, which is currently hosted at Universidade Federal da Fronteira Sul. Newton Marques Peron here. You can see the green logo there. This is the logo for that university, and he is a professor there. He is my former colleague at that institution. He will help us edit this volume. Myself and Italo us three will co-edit the volume, and so you're all invited to submit to that journal the papers presented here, or if you don't want to submit the exact paper you submitted here, you can submit a related paper in philosophy of fiction, whichever you prefer. And as a sort of a bonus, I should say that all Brazilian journals are open access. So that's I hope that is a stimulus that stimulates people publishing here. And so the deadline will be around October, or perhaps a little bit later. We still don't know. And but we will email you. We will let you know the exact dates and the exact norms for the submission.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of concluding remarks, I would like to thank all of you for participating in this colloquium, this second edition. It was great to have people back from the first edition and new people coming in. I would like to especially thank our invited speakers, our people who contributed papers, the presenters, the audience here on Zoom, the audience on YouTube. And it makes me very proud to be a part of this. So thank you, Italo, also for your work in co-organizing this. I mean, Italo did most of the work, of course, as usual, I should say, but I am very grateful to be a part of this, and I'm very happy on a personal level as well, because Italo is responsible for showing me this rich world of philosophy of fiction, and it's great to be a part of this community. I think our Congress was very successful, or our colloquium here was very successful in showcasing the very different themes and aspects and philosophical problems that can be derived from literature and from fiction, and the very different approaches that can be used to tackle those problems. So I think this is a very good example of the very exciting work being done around the globe in this subject. So thank you once again, everyone, and see you in 2 years, because it's a certain fact that we will have a third edition of this colloquium.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.